one of the things we'll be talking about is the sense that as therapists, we should be able to handle grief better when it happens to us. Or if it happens to someone else, there's a sense that we'll know what to say, where other people really struggle to know what to say. We'll just know what to say. None of that is true necessarily. You might. It might be even worse because you are a therapist and because you are expected to have this magic wand that's going to make them feel better. A lot of us, one of the things that I really like about therapy is that a lot of our clients feel better. They get better. There's improvements. Grief isn't quite like that. Grief isn't really about getting them to feel better. It's about helping them to integrate the grief into their lives, and that can be really challenging all by itself. And knowing all of that doesn't make us immune to struggling with it. I can remember when I was going through a particularly bad part of a grieving process and talking to my own psychologist and seriously saying, well, partly, we'll say I was like 80% serious, because even I knew it was nuts, but it was, okay, like, surely this is when being a psych comes in handy, right? There's like a secret shortcut through grief that only psychologists and counselors and therapists, it's something that only we know about. You can give it to me now, like, tell me what that is and I'll do that. Yeah, there's often a lot more hang-ups even than in some ways the general population gets permission to distance themselves from this. If they're being made to feel really uncomfortable by someone's grieving, they can kind of get the hell out of there. We don't get to do that. It's one of the many unspoken rules or taboos that we don't get to go the opposite way when someone is experiencing grief. So tonight I'm just going to very briefly touch on some of the, I suppose, most dominant theories around grief and loss. But those, everybody ascribes to a different theory, and I don't think there's really any kind of right or wrong in that respect, as long as, like anything, you're looking at it critically and you're figuring out how this applies for you or for your clients. So I'll just touch on a couple, and then one in particular that I think is quite relevant to the therapist's experience of grief when I'm talking about losing a client, as in, finishing up with them, planned or unplanned, whatever it might be, but that kind of ongoing relational loss that happens to us all the time. We'll talk a little bit as well about the client experience of therapeutic breakups, basically. But there's a lot of research, there's a lot of information out there on the client's experience of the end of therapy, or on general grief and loss, and how that's experienced in sessions. So again, quite brief on that. What we're really going to be focusing on is the therapist's experience of grief and loss. And we're going to be talking about it as understanding the dual impact that the end of the therapeutic relationship can have on the therapist and the client. We're going to talk about, and we're going to explore some personal strategies for managing all of those types of grief, whether it's the loss of a client, it's to the end of therapy, versus the loss of a client to death or suicide, as well as how to manage your own personal grief from your personal life when you're also working in this sphere, and obviously, talk about how we can just take care of ourselves and manage that extra layer or that extra burden when it comes to doing this work. And then, like I said, I have purposely left room at the end for Q&A. I did not have time to do up a quiz, unfortunately, but we might do a survey quiz after a few people have had time to watch the video too. Okay, so on grief and loss. And for those who aren't familiar with it, this is probably it sounds weird to have a favorite book on grief, but I do. Won't sound weird to any of you guys, actually, but most people are like, that's a bit strange. So On Grief and Grieving was written by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and is sort of the follow-up almost to On Death and Dying. But what I liked about this was, one, it talked about different types of grief. So it talked about not just loss through death, but loss through, work changes, through relationship changes, through whatever it might be. It wasn't necessarily just grief through death. And it also talked a lot about anticipatory grief, which I found very, very useful and very helpful. It's also written. So Elizabeth was writing this with David as she was dying. So you get a very personal insight into that process from her point of view, and it's quite a privilege, really, to one of the founders of grief theory, really, um, talking about her experience of grieving her own upcoming death, and supporting family members and everything, as and preparing for it, really was it's very, very good. um uh, the other one, actually, that was quite astounding in that way was Irvin Yalom's book. If you've come across that, he and his wife, who was dying, wrote a book together on their mutual experiences. Her experience of being the one who was leaving, and his experience of sort of watching her go, and a little bit of sort of afterwards. Fairly hard reading in some points, that one, but very, very, very good. So like I said, very brief overview of some of the sort of most dominant theories. But importantly, I always like to point out to anyone who will listen that grief is recognized as a medical condition with physical symptoms as well as the psychological, and you can't underestimate the power of those symptoms, and of that physiological impact. I think of it in some ways like your brain's just had this massive shock. Your world, your sense of self, your reality has been upended, and it's like your brain sort of puts you into a little bit of hibernation mode, almost. So there can be crying, there can be sadness, but there can also be actual brain fog. There can be insomnia, really bad insomnia. There can be appetite changes. There can be intense fatigue, not just tired, actual full fatigue. And there can be almost like a flashback, like a PTSD type flashback to moments leading up to the loss, or the moment of loss itself, even if it wasn't a traumatic death as such. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't something where you would expect to get traumatic type flashbacks. You have flashbacks to the moment of loss, and the moments leading up to it itself. It's like your brain puts you into hibernation so it can go over and over and over and figure out, how can we stop this from happening again, because this is not good. We're not set up for this. We don't like this massive change to our reality. What did we miss? Because if we can go over every single moment prior to this happening, we'll make sure this never happens again. And it's a particular type of torture, really, in that respect. You haven't slept, you're exhausted, and you keep reliving these moments, and feeling guilty that there was something different that you could have done to stop this from happening. But it is literally just the process your brain has to go through to try and make sense of something that often doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So some of the different theories. Most people are familiar with the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief. I know it's gone out of favor a lot in the last 10 years or so, and I think that's a little bit of a shame. It was never meant to be in her original book and in her original papers, Elizabeth doesn't talk about it as linear stages, and you go through this stage and then you're fine, and you go into this stage and then you're like, it was never supposed to be that, and somehow it became about that. And it's a shame, because I think those 5 stages that she talks about, they're not linear. It's very unusual that it's linear, but I have certainly found over the years that pretty much everyone's grief, and not just for death, not just the grief response to death, but anytime you're grieving anything, you do tend to get those 5 things in combination in some ways. So you always see denial. You always see a moment of like, this can't be real, this can't be happening. You always see anger. There's always anger. there's always bargaining of some sort. There's always depression, and there's often acceptance, but the acceptance comes in fleeting spurts. um, and some of those stages might last an hour, and others might last 3 weeks, 3 months, but they're all kind of there. And I don't know if you think through clients that you may have worked with or your own experiences of grief, please do let me know if you haven't encountered the 5 stages within that process. And I think it's actually a really helpful way to talk to the clients and to yourself about why these different feelings and reactions are coming up. But I don't know, they do seem to be necessary for our brain to process the shock. Whatever order they come in, however long each stage lasts for, however many times you flick back and forth between them, they do all seem to be necessary, I suppose, to get onto that integrated stage. Okay, so continuing bonds theory. So this is the idea that this is like in the book The Invisible String. It's the idea that no matter the distance, no matter the type of loss, that the people that we love, care about, had a connection to, that connection doesn't die. That you remain attached to them in some way, and that can be augmented by things like developing rituals. It's one of the reasons why, in every culture, there are ways to mark the death of a person, and there's often ways to stay connected to that. So in must be, I think it's like northeast China, or sort of that all the provinces on that side, they're very big on bringing offerings to the deceased on special anniversaries, and things like maybe they were buried with their glasses so that they could see their way in heaven. And so they bring them a glass cleaner or something or other to make sure that they can keep seeing their way in heaven, or they bring them their favorite food or something like that. But most cultures throughout the world have some way of maintaining that bond, keeping that bond alive, and that if we can, and that's not a bad thing at all, that we can and we need to carry on a relationship and a connection, just in a transformed way. And I think for what we're talking about here, when we're talking about therapists and clients and the termination of therapy and that type of loss, that this is a particularly useful approach or theory for that. This was something that the kind of quote at the end was something that I came up with. It's a couple of years ago, and it was looking at relational loss in particular, and the idea that excuse me, that we do have to have, it's kind of taking a little bit from all theories, that we do have to have a little bit of that dual process, in that we have to take care of the practical components. We need to take care of the practical stuff around the death or the loss, whether that's the actual death of a loved one and dealing with like the funeral and that kind of thing, or the end of the therapeutic relationship and dealing with the paperwork or whatever it might be. So we need to make space for the practical end of the relationship, or the rituals and the tasks that we need to signify that it's the end of that relationship, through to the emotional changes, whether that's going through the 5 stages, whether that's taking time to reflect in supervision, in therapy, whatever, around just whatever emotions are coming up, and accepting that those are the emotions that are coming up, rather than trying to shove them down and focus wholly on the practical stuff. You need the mix of both, and that way you can create an enduring connection that has meaning to you and the object of your loss. It's not like you haven't still lost, but you're finding your own meaning in it, and you are coming away with something that's enduring, something that's going to keep that person or that place or that time or that thing in your mind, but not get you completely mired in the emotions or the practicality. In its simplest form, it's allowing yourself to take care of the practical stuff, but not burying yourself in the practical stuff, allowing yourself to feel whatever emotions you happen to be feeling, and finding a way to take meaning away from that loss, to know that you can continue on changed, and that is okay as well. Where possible, I think it's really important that if we're trying to work from a sort of a limited reparenting capacity, or we're trying to become a positive attachment figure for someone who maybe hasn't had a lot of positive attachments in their past, then it's really impossible that we try and be that bigger, wiser self, which means being predictable and being consistent wherever we can. And when we know we're not going to be able to be predictable and consistent, we flag that from the start. So, if you know that you're going to be away for a certain amount of time, that you tell your clients and you give them time to prep and you give them time to manage whatever emotions that might be coming up. If you know that you are, just leaving forever, you're leaving that practice, or, you're going to be completely severing the relationship, preparing that for them and giving them as much predictability and consistency within that as you can. So, setting really clear expectations and boundaries around what that's going to look like. I'm guessing most of this isn't really new to a lot of people. Like I said, this stuff generally is talked about a lot more. It's the other side of things that we don't usually cover as much. All right, so therapist experience, and I've put the ring theory image there mainly to talk about it when we get to the client deaths, but something to keep in mind with any of the other sort of terminations as well. So planned terminations, much easier on the therapist as well. If this is, again, if you've been giving that predictability and consistency, it's good for the client, but it's good for you too. So it doesn't feel like it's coming out of left field. So even if the client, hits off and gets quite distressed, you've done absolutely everything that you can, and they were going to be upset, but there was nothing that you could have done further to mitigate that or prevent that. But even when it's a planned termination, even when everything has gone as well as can be expected, you've had the discussions early, they've had a really good outcome, they're really happy, you're really happy, and you're perfect breakup scenario, doesn't mean that it won't come with grief. You're still losing that relationship. It's like leaving a job that you really love. You might know it's the right thing to do, you might know it's time. It doesn't mean you're not sad about leaving that job. And perversely, I don't know if it's not perverse. It's just I can remember the I don't know, probably the first like big breakup with a long-term client, and I call them breakups on purpose because it is the loss of an important relationship. Not someone you've seen once or twice, but for a lot of our ongoing clients, we can work with them for quite a while and we can know pretty much everything about their lives. We know more about them than their partners or their parents or their, it's a very intense, intimate relationship. And when it was, and this was a child client who I really loved, and he was just so sweet, and he's, dad was a bit of a dick, but mum was gorgeous. I knew he was absolutely fine and good and ready to move on and all the rest of it. But I was not just sad because I was going to miss seeing him because he was just a nice kid and mum was nice and all the rest of it, but also sad because I'm like, but I always feel good when I see him because I can see the impact and the change and all the rest of it. And none of my other clients are doing as well. So there was also like a little bit of, this is what I mean. It's not perverse, but it was a little bit of almost like, oh, I wish you weren't quite as good and could stick around a little bit longer because you're so good to work with. And this is just so satisfying. And this is, so it was also a little bit of just a kind of a loss to the caseload. Which I think is something you have to be particularly careful of the longer you practice, because the longer you practice, the more and more of the, not easy, the more straightforward clients who will finish up and the more long-termers that are still sticking around. And so you can kind of lose practice when it comes to terminations, and you can start to get this sense because your entire caseload is long-termers and you're not seeing any like not rapid, but you're not seeing that same sort of change. If all you've got is long termers where change is happening very, very slowly, very incrementally, it can really start to distort your perceptions in terms of your efficacy as a therapist. So all of that needs to be considered when you're doing even a perfectly run to plan termination is still going to come with some feelings, with some grief. This is especially true if it is something like moving jobs where you have to break up with a whole bunch of clients all at once. In my case, it was when I went from doing like 3 clinical days a week to just doing 1, and I had to drastically cut down my caseload. I pretty much spent an entire month having almost back-to-back sessions where I was breaking up with all of these clients. And I wondered why I felt so exhausted and so crap. It was because, in the space of a month, I'd had more breakups than most people have in a lifetime. And that's what I mean about growing around the grief. I think because we do have more of these experiences than the general population, we do have capacity to grow a lot from it, but we have to take that into consideration and the impact that can have on us. Then we get to the unplanned breakups. And if you're game, an interesting exercise is to look at your entire caseload for the last like 2 years. This is what I mean. Like if you're game, this is not an easy exercise. Look through at the ones who are still going. Have you had the conversation about end of therapy planning with them? Look at the ones who dropped out, who ghosted you, who you've never seen again. Had you had that conversation with them at any point? And look at how many clients you finished up with in this planned way. Because I know the majority of mine for a long, long time, majority of the clients who finished up, it was unplanned. Maybe we started spreading things out a little bit, but then suddenly they just dropped off the face of the planet. And it's, 5 years later, just gotten in touch and like, oh my God, I need to see you next week. Like nothing has happened. Definitely getting into the practice or the habit of having those conversations about the end of therapy from the start of therapy. Very, very helpful. But there's always going to be a certain amount of unplanned terminations, of ghosting. That's just what happens.